I often bump into this concept that quote-unquote the masculine has dominated human history, and the implication that somehow women have had less to do with how far human civilization has come than have men. Even in supposedly enlightened spiritual circles, this narrative shows up. Almost as if the great feats of survival and ingenuity our ancestors achieved were all done independently by men who supposedly must have clambered over women to do the things they did, instead of taking comfort and solace in and drawing inspiration and energy from their personal relationships with women. Some things to consider if for some reason you believe the collective human story has been all about men. Every man, both the good and the bad, was birthed by a woman. Almost every man who ever did anything was doing it at least in part either to win the affection or approval of, protect or provide for a woman, and also for their children. Every man living who has ever lived grew up his entire life with a little boy inside him. Little boys want to love and be loved. They want to play, drive trucks, build forts, go on adventures. Anyone struggling with the misconception that masculine endeavours are somehow inherently destructive, wasteful and self-interested might find that keeping this in mind helps return some much-needed perspective to their worldview. Even your most highly despised masculine figures playing on the world stage right now contain that innocent little boy. Most women are not attracted to, have little respect for, and do not value the input of men who are not particularly masculine in some way, shape, or form. Usually this translates to, he must have a clear purpose in life, a purpose which will often take precedence over his personal relationships. Often the kind of single-minded masculine endeavour which has people believing in a notion like, the masculine has dominated. The masculine has dominated because that's what it does. The masculine leads, it protects, it provides for, it solves problems. It is direct, structured, practical and goal-oriented. The masculine does this not for its own selfish benefit, but for the benefit of all. And in the much wilder and more savage and uncivilized world our ancestors inhabited, the masculine fulfilling its divine purpose was absolutely crucial. The plain fact, if you get to know the well-documented masculine and feminine principles, is that femininity shows its power in very different ways to masculinity. I know that's stating what should be blindingly obvious, but evidently it goes over so many people's heads. The divine feminine does not, nor will it ever, show its power through war, big business, rulership, or politics. These are typically the arenas people cite when saying that men or the masculine have dominated. If a woman succeeds in war, big business, rulership, or politics, she is still a woman, of course, but she's succeeding in a masculine arena, doing masculine things. One key misconception is that woman equals feminine and man equals masculine. Of course, this is fundamentally what we are as a binary species, but all men ever have had their feminine side, and all women ever have had their masculine side, without exception. We are, after all created when the masculine and feminine principles collide during intercourse and fertilization. We contain both, and we express both. There have always been passionate, expressive, emotional men, and there have always been stoics. All men contain both modes, in fact, and most of us oscillate readily between the two. There have always been strong, independent, convention-defying, and thoroughly masculine women, too. Another key misconception is that the masculine has only its dark or negative side, and that now that the feminine is returning, although I don't really know from where it's supposedly returning as its influence is evident throughout every single chapter of human history, we're going to begin to see more light or positive things. To redress this imbalance in perception, here's a well-documented and widely agreed upon list of negative feminine traits or behaviours. Note, these are still negative feminine behaviours when being expressed by a man. Manipulation, selfishness, codependency, spitefulness, seduction, victimhood, insecurity, attention-seeking, self-delusion, the list goes on. To perceive only the negative side of masculinity and the positive side of femininity helps no one. People who believe a statement like the masculine has dominated perhaps do so because they're looking at a potential version of reality through two major lenses or filters. Firstly, history. That is the story we collectively tell ourselves about how we arrived where we are. And secondly, our own individual perceptions based on personal experience. If you choose to focus on the negatives, war, slavery, ravaging nature in the name of industry and expansion, if you focus on these aspects alone and equate that with the almost exclusively male leaders who ever saw these things and male followers who carried them out, then it's easy to build a case against what you call the masculine. But what a peculiar and biased lens through which to view things. It's also an illusion generated by the universally unavoidable difficulties in our interpersonal relationships. If you feel oppressed personally, you will resonate much more strongly with other forms of oppression, both contemporary and historical. And that goes for men equally as it does for women. Side note for context. Victimhood is a negative feminine trait and a negative trait of Pisces. Humanity is currently waking up from the dream, or nightmare depending on your subjective viewpoint, that has been the more than 2,000-year-long age of Pisces. And one great common task we're currently tackling as a species, both men and women, is the exposing and shedding of every type of victimhood. Indeed, like most things, modern feminism is a double-edged sword, and the side of that blade which cuts true, without victimhood or blame or projection, does serve a great and much needed purpose. There absolutely are balances and conventions in society which do require adjustment, outdated attitudes which can be put aside. This has always been and will always be the case because everything evolves. Many supposedly self-evident so-called facts we readily accept today will inevitably be dismissed and seen as evidence of our naivety and narrow-mindedness by future generations. Why, I ask, would anyone think any differently of the attitudes of previous generations? But victimhood is a powerful filter which warps our perception of everything it touches. In order to even have this conversation, we must be able, individually, to confront our victimhood, thus nullifying its confirmation bias. What I do readily accept is that inherently masculine endeavours such as exploration, engineering, construction, industry, science, war, governance and so on have been given greater historical importance than inherently feminine endeavours. The reason for this fact is simply that these masculine endeavours move things forward, whereas feminine endeavours typically maintain what has already been done, built or achieved, or exist in the realm of the arts or caring for the sick, elderly or new mothers and babies, and in mystical or spiritual realms. All incredibly important aspects of the overall experience, but apparently less historically noteworthy, at least from a mainstream perspective. This apparent imbalance in historical records occurs regardless whether or not such endeavours were being undertaken by men or by women, and it does not mean that men were more important or somehow in charge of women, however. I absolutely and wholeheartedly would agree that mainstream history is terribly biased in the way it highlights masculine achievements and leaves feminine ones as a kind of assumed footnote at best, as if to say, if those things didn't get done, well, we wouldn't be able to do the really important stuff, kind of thinking. This, I would agree with any feminist, is an area which might require adjustment. It is inescapable that we use the word his story and not her story, or indeed our story. Such linguistic clues are never entirely accidental and often prove to be very deliberate when explored with curiosity and an open mind. But hopefully it's clear that inherently feminine achievements as a footnote in mainstream history does not happen because men were exclusively doing masculine things and women were exclusively doing feminine things. Of course, as a binary species, we naturally gravitate one way or the other, but we've all met or know men who do art or music for a living, or are care workers or cleaners, and we've all met or know women who do manual labour or drive professionally. If these are indeed modern phenomena, well then I welcome that change which we call equality of opportunity. I just don't believe for a second that women doing masculine jobs and masculine things in general has never been a thing, or that women were or are somehow disadvantaged by defaulting to traditionally feminine roles. I also don't believe tradition or societal expectation can be held to blame, because supposedly that's been relatively well exposed now, and oh look, all the dudes mowing the motorway verges are still dudes. All the checkout chicks at the supermarket are still chicks. I say vive la différence. Let's be honest, the vast majority of men in history were not leaders or bold explorers. They weren't captains of industry or landowners. They were miners, sailors and builders, factory workers and soldiers. They did the dirtiest, most physically difficult and most dangerous work so that women didn't have to. In many cases, they overcame their fear, risked their lives, and often broke their bodies to spare their families the same. I would never say that doing laundry, cooking, or caring for children is an easy option, but it's hard to see the oppression in a system like that. It seems to me exceptionally well balanced and indeed even fair. For every woman who spent her days cleaning, there was a man who spent his days elbow deep in oil and grease. For every man who spent his days counting his money, there was a woman who spent her days pampering herself. Let us address at this point what will be the elephant in the room for some. Yes, it is absolutely ridiculous by our modern standards that once upon a time women were denied the privilege of voting. This to me is actually quite insane, and a great piece of evidence that society did indeed have some inherent imbalances, and certainly through a modern lens, it's kind of embarrassing to think that there were once presumably people of significant influence, yes, predominantly although not exclusively men, who thought that it was a bad idea to let women formally contribute a preference for political leadership. The one saving grace for these miserable old gits is that we've now had an entire century of women's privilege to vote in most Western nations, and most levels of government appear to the casual observer to be a bigger fucking clown show today than ever before. As we love to remind everyone who watches this channel, however, correlation is not causation, so we won't necessarily be holding women responsible for the state of modern government. We're not struggling as a society to create equality. Equality is already guaranteed by our immortal divine origin and sovereign choice to incarnate as humans, yes, as men and women. What some of us seem to be struggling to understand is that women are not supposed to become like men, whatever that could possibly mean, for there to be equality. The most masculine or man-like women often seem to be the least happy. I guess the need for equality might trump the desire for happiness in some cases. The feminine has always been here. It never went anywhere. Some people are just looking for it in masculine arenas, failing to find it, and concluding entirely erroneously that there's an imbalance. Solution? Begin by withdrawing your attention from mainstream media, or any alternative media or social media which typically concerns itself with similar topics. Withdraw your attention from any media which highlights inequality or division between the sexes. This is a near impossibility for some people, so determined are they to place the locus of control of their own existence outside of themselves. If you go looking for problems, you will find them everywhere. Yes, you may give yourself the illusion of power through being quote-unquote informed about the wider world, but bear in mind that the only true power any of us have is over ourselves. The only lasting satisfaction you can ever have will come from within, and from creating harmonious, sustainable relationships with your immediate surroundings. This is only possible through creating a harmonious relationship with yourself. How do you achieve this most intelligently and effectively? By trying to remotely influence the thoughts and actions of others thousands of miles away? Or by letting go and tending your own garden instead? Ironically, such an approach to life is a prime example of feminine power. Stop feeding on that familiar triggered feeling you get when looking outside of yourself, or at least notice when it arises and make a serious attempt to discover its source, its true source. You only align with external adversity when you're not at peace internally somehow. Deliberately flood your daily feed, digital and otherwise, with positive, balanced, hopeful, and empowering people and stories. The things you look at every day are a choice, They are programming your subconscious mind, and your subconscious mind is creating your experience, not the other way around. One final thought if my little video here is still not getting through. Please look at the average male political leader in today's world and tell me you find him a good embodiment of the divine masculine. I'll laugh you off the bloody internet.